second. So Peter, you have a extensive history from farming to teaching classes on agriculture to being a part of the National Resources Defense Council. Now you are at Earth Justice and you are an author. I do have your book right here, Farming for Our Future, the Science, Law, and Policy of Climate Neutral Agriculture. So I think this presentation is just going to be a really wonderful continuation of what we've learned together today. I am so excited to hear about cows, corn, and crap, climate change and agriculture. So without further ado, Peter, I'm going to hand over the reins to you.
Well, thank you, Liz, both Liz for inviting me to join you. And it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you today. I think I first met Liz many, many years ago, and I've been always so impressed by the work of the Illinois Stewardship Alliance and its important work. So I'm really quite honored to be with you. I'm also excited that Earth Justice, where I now work, recently opened up an office in Chicago, our first presence in the Midwest. Before I was at Earth Justice, I was at NRVC, and during my time there, we opened up also a new office in Chicago. So it's, I think, a recognition by the sometimes overly bi-coastal environmental groups of the importance of Illinois in particular and the Midwest more broadly. So again, a real honor and a pleasure to be here. As Liz noted, I've just written this book, which is great. Unfortunately, you can't call a book quite as directly as you can title a presentation. So this presentation is called Cows, Corn, and Crap, but the book has a more formal title. The reason I name it that is because that's really all you have to remember when you are thinking about climate change and agriculture. You see this little controls up top, or do you get a good view of the slideshow?
Yes, perfect view of the slideshow.
Okay, perfect. And that is because basically it is from cows, as you'll see, from the corn that is fed to them, and the cow's manure that the vast majority of climate change emissions from agriculture derive. And that's both a challenge and an opportunity. It's a challenge because those are hard emission sources to deal with, but it's an opportunity because we already know a fair amount. So I'm going to go through a little bit on sort of background of agriculture. And I think my guess is many of you already know a lot about this, but when I end up talking to audiences about environmental issues and climate change in agriculture, while everyone has a really good sense of food, most people have very little sense of agriculture and our agriculture system in this country. And it's the good parts of it and the challenging parts of it. So I'm going to go through some of that. I hope it's not too repetitive for many of you, but it'll sort of get us set on where we are. So one thing that you will sometimes hear is that the food system is broken. And I think that's really a misnomer because the food system is doing what it's intended to do, which is to produce a vast amount of largely commodity food, not what's really in this picture, really remarkably inexpensively. So we produce 430 billion pounds of food every year, which is a lot more than we need. In addition, American agriculture produces cotton and wool and a lot of biofuels. There's a lot of corn grown in Illinois for biofuels. Illinois and Iowa are the two main ethanol states. And it's a very international system. We export about 20 or 25% of our food. It goes up and down quite a bit. That's largely grains and meats. And as you see here, I've highlighted some facts about Illinois in this presentation. About half of the grain produced in Illinois is exported. I think the total agriculture impact in Illinois is about $19 billion a year. The country also imports a lot of food, which is largely fruits, vegetables, and fish. But all of this, as we said, is in a sense working. Americans are paying a lot less for their food than they did before. The downside of this is that farmers are not getting much of the benefit of this. They are getting squeezed while the big food processors are having terrific years. Farmers generally receive less than 8 cents of every food dollar. And that's obviously quite a squeeze on them. But you'll see in a minute, this apparently cheap food is really only apparently cheap, and that's the challenge we face. Because our agriculture system produces or causes a number of impacts that have hidden costs. So let's just take one, drinking water. Agriculture is one of the main challenges to drinking water systems, from nutrients, from pesticides, both groundwater and surface water systems. And then that has to be treated by municipal water treatment systems or the like. And that's a cost that is really due to the pollution, often say nutrient runoff from industrial animal facilities or from fields, that the agriculture system is externalized. And similarly, of course, many of you, I think pretty much all of us, will have, for example, atrazine, a very common pesticide used on corn in our blood. And so there's tremendous hidden health impacts that we pay through our lives, through our health insurance, et cetera, that is not borne actually by the agriculture industry. And many other issues as well are antibiotic resistance, because we use most of our, about 70% of the medically important antibiotics are used routinely in animal feed, not to make sick animals healthy the way we use them with our kids, but rather with just to compensate for the unsanitary conditions. So there's a lot of impacts that agriculture has, and as a result, there was a study a while ago, and this was not done by an environmental group, this was done by one of the big four accounting groups, that said that of all these industries in the US, it's the only one where the externalities, these hidden costs of pollution, of water, of drinking water contamination, of our healthcare, really dramatically exceed the total cost, the total income of the sector. EBITDA is earnings before income, taxes, depreciation, and amortization, but you can think of it as how much is the sort of net income of the sector. There was recently a Rockefeller Foundation report that came to the same thing, which is that the true cost of our food is about 3 times what our apparent cost is. So it looks like our system is working, producing a lot of cheap food, but in fact, that food is expensive. It's just that it is really expensive elsewhere. So now we're going to focus a little bit on climate change. And this is an area that often, even just a few years ago, conversations about climate change pretty much ignored agriculture. You think climate change, you think belching smokestacks, coal-fired power plants, you think big trucks. You essentially think burning of fossil fuels, carbon, coal, oil, and gas, and that's climate change. The reality is that agriculture has a very significant impact on climate change, and as you'll see, it's more significant than people realize. So the good news is that 4 or 5 years ago, people pretty much thought agriculture's contribution to climate change was about 0. Now they look to EPA's number, this pie chart up here, and they sort of think, okay, maybe it's about 9 or 10%. But as you'll see, it's actually a more significant impact than that. But part of the challenge is it's different. Again, it's not the burning of fossil fuels. Where does it come from? Well, to go back to our title, it comes from cows, corn, and crap. First, think about corn. When you put nitrogen fertilizer onto soil, by and large, in this country and other countries, farmers, for a number of good reasons, put about twice as much fertilizer onto the land, onto their crops, as the crops can actually take up. So that excess fertilizer, that extra nitrogen, it's got to go somewhere. And it either runs off, and I'm sure you all know a lot about eutrophication and harmful algae blooms and contamination that goes down the Mississippi River, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And it also becomes air pollution. It converts through microbial action into different nitrogen compounds, including nitrous oxide, which is about close to 300 times stronger than CO2 as a global warming potent force. It's also about the most significant depleter of our ozone layer, which of course protects us from sunburn and other things. So that's a big part. Most of the nitrous oxide in the country is emitted by agriculture, about 70–80% of it. The other big source is methane. Methane comes in two ways from cows and other sheep. It is because they are ruminants, their guts produce methane. And every time they breathe out, it's sort of belching, but it's really just every time they breathe out or otherwise emit gases, that has a lot of methane. And that's called enteric methane. And it's interesting that enteric methane is a greater source of methane, like according to the president's recent methane plan, than the gas industry. It's a huge source of methane. And it's from cows that are grazing, they're in capos, it's everywhere. Those cows also poop, and when their manure is handled, particularly when it's handled in wet systems like it is in a dairy, or in this case also say swine waste is handled in these big manure lagoons. Those conditions, those anaerobic conditions without air, create a lot of methane, much more methane than say on a grazing system where the manure is dumped on the ground and it's dry. Methane over 20 years is about 85 times stronger than carbon dioxide. And so if you add up the enteric methane and the other emissions, and then the manure methane, it's more than the whole oil and gas sector. Agriculture, essentially cows, but also some swine manure, is the largest source of climate change, of methane in the United States. And then there's two other ways. One is carbon dioxide, and that's from the on-farm energy use and electricity, which is not included in that pie chart that you see here. Food processing, distribution, preparation, and imagine once you leave the farm, before it gets to your house and you get to eat it, there's a lot of other steps. That's in some ways, some people think of that more as food system than agriculture. But of course, earlier, there's also fertilizer pesticide manufacturing, as you probably know. Fertilizer is very, very energy intensive. So a ton of energy, carbon dioxide, is emitted in producing all that fertilizer. And then the last issue is the soil carbon. And that's a tricky one to understand, but good, healthy soil, the grasslands that I'm sure you all know of, healthy grasslands around you, have a tremendous amount of carbon in them. When you till them up and use them for agriculture, essentially oxygen from the air mixes with carbon in the soil, becomes carbon dioxide, and it's lost. So you have soils that are denuded of carbon, and you have emissions of carbon dioxide. And so every time you convert land, you lose a lot of carbon. And that's important because, as you see here, agriculture is what uses most of our land in this country. 62% of our land in the contiguous US is agriculture. It's even more in Illinois. 75% of Illinois is in agriculture. If you ever get a bird's eye view of anywhere, you look down and that's what you see. And if you look at this chart, you see the vast majority of it is rangeland, pasturing cows. But you see also a huge part of it is livestock feed. That's about half of the grain. And you'll see also feed exports below on this chart. And then the food we eat above. And we see that about half of our cropland is used for animal feed, and half is used to actually provide human food. So agriculture uses a tremendous amount of land, which really no other sector of the economy does. We certainly know if there's a big mine or something like that, you know it and it's ugly and you may be concerned about it. But its actual footprint is not that much. It's really agriculture. So what you see is, oops, with this. We seem to have missed a slide that I wanted to show, but that's all right, I'll explain it. So when you convert the land, you both you lose that carbon, but then that land, being in agriculture, also loses the ability that it otherwise would have every year to sequester carbon. So you have both that initial slug of carbon that's lost to the atmosphere, and you have that continuing loss opportunity to pull carbon out of the atmosphere that healthy land does. And if you add all of this together, you'll see that agriculture really has a much bigger impact than that little wedge of 9%. If you add the on-farm energy and the fertilizer manufacturer, and you recognize the land impacts, it's much more like a quarter or more, and depending on what you include, maybe up to a third of the total global warming impact in the United States. So I'm going to shift a little bit. So I just was saying these are the impacts of agriculture. So who is agriculture, and what does that mean? As I'm sure all of you know, agriculture has just traditionally gotten much, much more concentrated over the past really 50 years, but it's continuing almost every year. You see a lot of this in the press right now with the president pushing proposals that might get through Congress to try to address the market power of the big four meat packers. But it's not just the meat packers, but it's control of cropland, it's control of every aspect of this, the pesticides, of seeds, of everything. And just for example, in Illinois, you've got half as many farms, and the average is about twice as big as it used to be. And that, what you're seeing, is happening everywhere else. And nationwide, what we see is a small number of operations produce the vast majority of our commodity food. And because, for example, the small number of these operations hold most of the animals, they also produce the vast majority of the agricultural pollution. One thing that's important is to know, though, of course, that climate change also very much affects agriculture. And I manage some farms, and I can tell you, it is clobbering us. The weather patterns are different. Pests that we didn't have to worry about, we looked elsewhere and we thought, glad we don't have to deal with those, have come in and have been really tough to control. You not only have different weather patterns, we all have been seeing much more extreme weather coming more often, floods and droughts and extreme heats and others. And this is having an enormous impact on the farm economy. And that is driving some people to think about reforms that we'll talk about shortly, because, for example, our crop insurance is paying out more and more. And maybe we should think about how can we make our farms more resilient so we don't, and can pay ahead of time and more resilient farms than let them get clobbered and pay afterwards, which also, of course, affects our food security. The good news here is that there's a lot of evidence that the current system, which is very chemical dependent, large-scale monocultures, is not the only effective system. There's a lot of other ways to grow, essentially using nature rather than trying to kill everything in the land and putting chemicals to replace what you killed, that have been proven to be effective, highly productive, and in many cases, highly profitable. Almost anyone who has shifted to these other approaches doesn't have any interest in returning back to sort of the chemical dependent monocultures of before, producing commodity crops like that, because they're more profitable for them. So that's a great opportunity we have. So what are those? Those are, and we'll go into the more detail, but some of them are things that I'm sure many of you know about. Perennial crops. This is a great picture comparing the root system of perennial crops to annual crops. And on the right is a perennial, and on the left is an annual. And you can imagine that if you have a flood, if you have a drought, if you have a heat wave, if you are trying to pull nutrients from the soil, that huge root mass is vastly more effective than the little root mass. And if you want to store carbon, look how much more carbon is stored in that perennial root mass. So that's one opportunity. We talked earlier about nitrous oxide, the result of fertilizer. We can use fertilizer better. We can avoid fertilizer use by different crop rotations and using cover crops that naturally put nutrients into the ground. We can graze differently, we can manage manure, we can manure differently. And one exciting thing here is that this is an area that has been starved for research and development. Public funding of research is about half of what it used to be. And interestingly, agricultural research studies have shown some of the most cost-effective and valuable research in any type of research. And yet it's been cut dramatically. And what research there is on none of it, or very little, about 5%, is on what we would think of as sustainable approaches. So imagine if we actually tried to study these areas a bit more. I'm just going to go into some of these things a little more. I mentioned fertilizer opportunities. There's this great study of I'm from New York. Cornell is a great ag school here. They are trying to encourage farmers to use a mass balance accounting approach to nitrogen management. And they're finding that just really careful measuring and monitoring what's in the soil, how much you put in, and how much is taken out from the crops. You can just that, you don't need a fancy machine, just thinking more carefully about what you're putting on reduces fertilizer use on the farms you're using it by 20–30% with no impact on yield, and if anything, even more yield. So there's a lot of opportunities, but people are used to doing things in a certain way, and fertilizer in the past has been cheap, and you figure throw it on and just a picture of the year. Frankly, it would be sort of interesting with the war in Ukraine and increasing fertilizer costs as well as food costs, as well as because fertilizer is made largely from fossil fuels, and so the impact of the war on the oil and gas market will affect fertilizer prices. This may be a good time to use this to help farmers transition to more careful fertilizer use, organic fertilizer opportunities that will have much lower water pollution and climate impact. I mentioned no-till farming. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but you do need to have different machines, and cover crops are different. You have to learn what actually works in your area. And then there is traditionally this feeling that there was competed with cash crops. And the good news is that it doesn't, it actually can enhance. I mentioned earlier before this is basically trees and shrubs. All those perennial roots make a huge difference and provide, many of them have ancillary benefits, especially as it's getting warmer. The shade that is provided to cows or other livestock and to plants can be really critical in terms of resilience as well as climate change mitigation. I didn't realize, but cattle are a major part of the Illinois agricultural economy. And so this is something where there's a lot of interest in better grazing. Instead of just letting them go, have them act a little bit more like the bison on the plains, move through intensively eat, tromp in their manure, fertilize the land, increase.
I don't think anybody hated her.
And then move on. I'm sorry?
Sorry about that, Peter. I'll fix that.
Okay, so great opportunities there, as well as managing manure and confined operations. So, and as I said, lots of others that we can develop. So why does this matter? What's really exciting here, and this is if you take our emissions, according to EPA, and then you imagine using just some of these practices, and this is the reductions in carbon emissions and the increase in carbon in the soil that you could get just by using these practices that we mentioned on the amount of land for which it's applicable, using numbers that the Natural Resource Conservation Service and what's called the Comment Planner thinks will be sort of the average impact on carbon. And if we actually did this on all available cropland, look where we'd be. We would have our agricultural economy sector could be less than negative, less than neutral. It's obviously a thought experiment. This is applying these practices to all of our land, but you can see that even if it was just half of the land, it would be quite significant. And this is, again, just the impact, what we know now. Imagine if we really do some research and start getting better understanding, better opportunities there. It's really sort of quite exciting. And I will say on our own farm, where we have learned a lot, we've changed what we've done, and we're one of the first to be certified as carbon neutral because of these types of practices. So it really does work. The challenge is right now, these are great practices. They've been proven. They have these climate resilience benefits and these climate mitigation benefits, but they're not used much. And as you see, they're used on very few of our acres overall. And so what we need is we need policy change in order to increase adoption of these practices. And that's the great opportunity in the Farm Bill, and that's the great opportunity at the state level that folks like you can be advocating for. So what are those policy changes we need? You basically need, if you think of it, our main policies are the Farm Bill, which is every 5 years a major federal bill that provides tremendous amounts of money to farms, and that money creates policy incentives and disincentives. We have our energy policy laws, which are largely relevant here, the renewable fuel standard, without which we really wouldn't have corn ethanol. It is a mandate for oil manufacturers to include corn ethanol or ethanol in their mix. And they might mix some of it in if it weren't for the mandate, but it wouldn't be much. So much of it really, we need to look at that because recent studies, and it's fiercely fought, but a lot of recent studies suggest that especially if you take into account the land use impact, this corn ethanol is not good for the climate. It's not the climate solution many would like it to be. It's actually worse than equivalent to neutrality. And then there's our environmental statutes. We're talking about environmental impact. We could change many of our environmental laws, most of which largely exempt agricultural activities. So, for example, CAFOs, even though they're major sources of water and air pollution, are largely don't require an air pollution permit, even though they're major sources of ammonia and hydrogen sulfide, two toxic gases that can kill people. It doesn't, they're major sources of methane, and they're not being covered under methane reduction plans. They're also major water pollution sources, and in many states, they are largely not covered by either federal or state water pollution permits. So let's look at some of the changes, particularly to the Farm Bill, that will be important to look for. And I say particularly the Farm Bill because the Farm Bill, unlike these other laws, gets reauthorized every 5 years. We tried at various times to amend, say, the Clean Water Act. It was last amended in 1987 and has not really been changed since. The Clean Air Act hasn't really been changed since 1990. So, and given Congress today, it's going to be hard to get any good changes to those bills. But the Farm Bill has to be changed every 5 years, has to be reauthorized. So that provides us an opportunity to make some changes, perhaps not huge ones, but with enough effort, maybe we can get some bigger changes. So what are some of the things that we can look at? One of them is simply don't make it so hard for the farmers who want to do the right thing. Right now, there's a lot of disincentives. They discourage conservation locations, the way payment calculations are done, for example, and make it harder for a farmer to use, say, a 4-year rotation, which will have tremendous ecological benefits. You'll often need less fertilizer, less pesticide, you'll have more soil carbon in the soil, healthier soil. But it's harder to get your government payments. Similar challenges with cover crops, the whole edifice of crop insurance and commodity payments pretty much doesn't even think about perennial crops. And so farmers are really discouraged to try those. So one is simply do no harm. Let's stop the barriers for both row crops and for better grazing, and try to give the opportunity. This wouldn't be a mandate. This is simply saying, let's get rid of these barriers, which really probably weren't thought of when the programs were first developed. But now we realize have these big disincentives. And then let's try to create some incentives. As you probably know, we've tried to spend many billions of dollars every year on conservation programs. And it's interesting that even the NRCS has found, the Natural Resource Conservation Service, has found that a number of them are actually counterproductive. So we're paying farmers to do these practices that the NRCS itself has said aren't effective, or at least maybe they just do nothing. So we could target this funding better, and it's all a question of how things are ranked and prioritized. And so we could prioritize climate-friendly practices, put more funding into climate-friendly, climate-resilient practices to use this conservation funding more effectively. Lots of details that I won't get into now, but the great news, as I said, is that there are a lot of opportunities within these already existing programs. One of the great opportunities that you see here is one of the conservation programs, which is called CRP, pays farmers not to work their land, usually in 10, sometimes longer year contracts. And unfortunately, many times land is at the end of one of these contracts, it goes back into production. So a lot of the soil carbon benefits are lost. And there was just a study out by USDA that very little of this land is actually put into perennials. It's usually just native grasslands, which is obviously cheap and easy, but also easy to reverse. So we should think about, okay, what we really need now is longer term, better carbon benefits. How can we take this terrific program, a lot of enthusiasm, by and large, more farmers apply to it they can actually get into the program, and make it more climate friendly with longer term, more carbon focused easements. Again, not a crazy radical change, but could have a big climate impact and a big water quality impact. You've heard me talk a lot about research, the desperate need for research here, because it's so much lower than it used to be. The good news, again, is that there are places that already exist within USDA. There are these climate hubs that were set up during the Obama administration and that still exist. There are agroforestry centers and other centers that exist. They're tiny now. And many of them are holding on by a shoestring, but they provide, you don't have to invent a new program. You can just fund those programs better, as this current administration is doing. And then you can imagine soon we'll see some great benefits very quickly. And then, of course, there's the opportunity, and usually the programs are similar. You think of research and outreach together, and they often do go together. Many of the staff is the same. We have thousands of people in the field, and this is federal staff, but my guess is Illinois has state staff as well. We do in New York, we have state soil and water conservation experts, and both the NRCS experts and the state soil and conservation district experts, as well as other experts from other agencies, can all be encouraged to really focus on these more sustainable practices. In climate, if we really did have a climate mandate here. So there's really tremendous opportunity. And I find it again on our own farm where once somebody has figured something out, everyone else just wants to learn from them. It's hard and a little scary to do it for yourself the first time. But if somebody else has done it and they're not so far, they do something similar, then you're much more likely to give it a try. So this is a tremendous opportunity. I mentioned earlier some of the changes to environmental statutes that we can deal with in some of the energy statutes. So those are all opportunities. And a lot of this can be done at the state level. For example, dealing with, say, water pollution from PFOS. States can have more stringent rules than the federal government. Many states, some states prohibit that, but many states can. The federal government allows that. So they can have laws or permits that are a little more stringent and address the water and air pollution from PFOS. Everything I've talked about can be done at the state level, and that's a really great opportunity because frankly, sometimes it's easier to change state law than it is to change federal law. There's going to be federal state law that provides research opportunities. There's state laws that state programs that provide outreach and technical support. There are usually state programs that provide financial assistance to support, say, agricultural non-point source water pollution, runoff pollution, which often is very similar and causes climate change impacts as well. So all of these programs can be expanded, can be improved, can be increased better targeting, and there's great benefits to the farm community back home. And then lastly, and I don't have a slide on this, states and the federal government can all use their procurement powers. The federal government buys billions of dollars of food every year. States buy billions of dollars of food every year for their schools, for their universities, for their prisons, for their other sort of services to the elderly or others. And all of that can be directed at procurement dollars, can support climate-friendly, sustainable food. Many states already have a provision that, for example, allows procurement of food that costs a little more, say up to 10% more for local food. And that same idea, we can pay a little bit more for sustainable food. We can pay a little bit more for climate-friendly food. There's what's called the Cool Food Pledge that a number of cities, most recently New York City, has joined. We're trying to get New York State to join it, which which governments can adopt to first measure and then try to lower the carbon footprint of their food purchases. There's also the Good Food Purchasing Program. It was first started in Los Angeles. I think Chicago has already joined this, where they agree to buy food that meets 5 values: nutrition, value, labor, local economy, and then 2 environmental sustainability, and animal welfare. So the procurement power is a great opportunity for people, for you folks to advocate for, because every government, whether a small town or a big state or the federal government, can use that procurement power for the better. So how do you pull this all together? I tend to think of, people often ask, so what can you do? And they sort of think, well, do I go out and scream in the street, or what should I do personally? And I think it's important to think that the answer is both. Political action and personal action are closely linked. The way I think of it is, imagine if you start biking more, you're going to then become more of an advocate for bike lanes because you see the benefits and the importance of bike lanes. And then as there's more bike lanes, there's more people who can advocate for more better bike lanes or other. And it goes together. If you try to eat lower on the lower carbon diet, which tends to be more plant-based, as you'll see from this, you tend to start thinking, go to a restaurant, you think, wow, there's no plant-based foods options here except the sides. So you start asking for that. So personal and political action, I think, come together. Some of the big opportunities are what we talked about. The Farm Bill are coming up. Really important. It looks like yours to engage and really engage very intensely in the Farm Bill discussions coming up. Take a look at the exemptions in environmental laws for agricultural facilities. And again, it's important to remember when you think about that most of the pollution is coming from about 5% of the facilities, the 5% of the facilities that may have 1,000 or more cows or many thousands of acres of land. And so if you use your regulatory authority for those largest, I think in many ways the government could be saving its financial ability to provide incentives for the smaller family farmers, more integrated farms, rather than spending all the money on the biggest industrial scale farms. As I said at the very beginning, most people really they think about food all the time, but they don't think about climate change in agriculture. They don't really realize that their cheap food has hidden costs in water pollution, in drinking water control, in climate change, in our healthcare costs. And people really need to understand that because so often there's this fear that if you do anything on the agriculture system, oh my gosh, it's going to make the food cost more. But really, most of what those changes would do is just reduce costs that we are incurring elsewhere and put them into a place where farmers can control them, where our system can control them and figure out how to deal with them more effectively. So when I say this bottom bullet here, educate everybody, it's really important because pretty much everybody gets the idea that a big coal-fired smokestack, that's dirty. But people don't realize that what they don't see the hidden harms of our industrial food system. And it's really important to get that word out there. So thank you. I'd be happy to take questions. I'll stop sharing my screen. And hopefully, if people have questions, I'd be happy to chat.
Thank you so much, Peter. Round of applause for you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Very, very informative, and so it's timely, and it's information that I feel like resonates really well with this audience, which is mixed with eaters, farmers, agency folks. We did have legislators earlier. I don't think they're still with us, but there's a lot of people here that can take note on those ways to take action. Many of us are already working on some of these priorities, but I know you've planted some seeds into many minds on what we can do to continue this work and to ask for those recommendations. So before I get to some questions, I know we do have some in the chat. If you could just kind of ground us, I know you mentioned that you are a farmer, where your farm is located, and you did mention that your farm is carbon neutral. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. I will admit it's a different type of farm than they may extent. It's a coffee farm, and it is in Central America, where my family and families from there together own this coffee farm. And when we got involved, it was sort of a typical, what was called industrial coffee farm, which means no shade trees, just coffee trees everywhere. And we began to realize that probably wasn't a very good approach. And when I started pushing it, I honestly had some sense that it wasn't a very sustainable approach, but I didn't know much of what to do. So I looked around and I found something that was then called Eco-OK Coffee. It's now called the Rainforest Alliance, which had standards which we could try to meet, and that would then get certified, but it would also make the farm more ecologically sound. So we looked at that, and we took a couple of years, but we have now been certified under the Rainforest Alliance for I think 14, maybe 15 years. And so as a result of that, we put shade trees. Now, if you look in the farm from above, it doesn't look that different from the native forest. We put stream buffers, and we don't grow anything right around the streams. There's a lot of, we're on the side of a volcano, so there's a tremendous amount of water. And it's really amazing to see the difference in water quality after a rain. It's in Costa Rica where there's can be heavy rainstorms. And even after a rainstorm with the river buffers, the rivers stay clear. It's really pretty amazing. And that was not the case 20 years ago. And we've done some studies, and others with academics who've done some studies. The number of species that have been found on the farm has gone up tremendously, from I think about 30 to about 75. We have, so all of that was done with the rainforest, and then we wanted to go further. And we also have a small processing plant where the coffee beans are taken and sort of peeled and dried. And that's what we sell, green coffee beans. They get roasted, they turn black, and then you drink them. We wanted to address carbon. And when we started, really nobody knew even how to measure the carbon footprint of a coffee farm. Now, coffee is a big business around the world. There's 25 million coffee farmers around the world, and in many, many different countries. So actually, there's a whole IPCC effort to figure out how you determine the carbon footprint of a coffee farm. So we sort of were asking there. We had some Costa Rican and some European research institutes to try to figure this out. Now there's sort of a protocol. And we changed some of our fertilizer management practices and a couple other things, and a number of other things. But between the rainforest, what we did for the Rainforest Alliance, and all the shade trees and the buffers and the fertilizer management and other things we did at the processing plant with the wastewater, we are now, I think, one of the very first coffee farms to be certified carbon neutral, I think almost anywhere in the world. So it's possible. It's pretty tough, but it's actually, in the end, it's tough in the sense that you have to learn something. It's not, but it's very exciting, and it's really, I think we all are thrilled to be a part of that. And I think the farmers that we've all talked to that have been on the cutting edge of the practices that I mentioned, they all are similarly very excited and charged. It's a lot more interesting. So I hope that's helpful.
It is. No, and congratulations on that certification. As we're talking earlier, I think everyone's aware we're all dealing with different soil types and challenges. I don't know if anyone's butting up next to a volcano, though, so that's a little different.
I guess there's many volcanoes in Illinois.
Well, I do have a few more here. Let's see. So do you have an idea of what states are leaders in demonstrating good return on investment in their soil health programming? Kind of asking from the perspective that this could maybe help make the case for the ask in Illinois here that Max Webster highlighted of the 15 million plus that we need to keep our healthy soil programs going.
So, as is often the case, California has been at this longer and has been putting a lot more money. I think they have put in, the past few years, I think $75 million to their soil health program. I'm in New York, and some particular effort there. We got a soil health and climate resiliency bill passed last year that codified a climate resilient farming bill. It had been moving along at a couple million a year, and in the most recent budget, the new governor, Kevin Local, has proposed to increase that to 15 million. So it hasn't passed yet, but I think it's in her budget, and I think the legislature will support it. So Illinois could look to California and New York at least. I know Massachusetts passed a state healthy soil bill. And now actually, I think the last count is something like 17 or 18 states have passed some form of a healthy soil bill, which by and large try to increase funding for climate resilient farming practices. In New York, our bill also created soil health standards, which are voluntary, but give farmers something to aim at. And then if they achieve them, they can say, I've done this, an objective measure that then they can do something with. And so I think you're seeing some of that as well. You're also seeing New York and many other states, as I mentioned, using the procurement power to support these practices.
Yes, yes. Procurement is always tricky here in Illinois, but we are working on the Good Food Purchasing Program policy. So I see some bright lights in our future here. And no, that's really helpful. I know Max has been working really closely with Stephen Coletti. I'm sure you know that name. I feel like he's been a part of every healthy soils bill in every state. So yeah, I'm excited to see what Illinois can do. Funding is always a challenge here, but we can get creative, that's for sure. I'm gonna let Ashley come off mute and ask his question, and then Scott, I will get to yours in just a moment.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, I just was curious about I couldn't hear all of Peter's talk. There was a little bit of feedback, and so hopefully he hasn't already addressed this, but in terms of carbon neutral farming, just curious if on his farm they've taken into account indirect land use change. Pretty much all of the life cycle assessments that have been done for organic and regenerative agriculture have left out the lack of, or the decline on average, not across the board, but on average, there's a decline in productivity. And particularly with the system that he described, I would imagine that when you convert from a conventional farming practice to a permaculture type farming practice, not saying it's not possible, but oftentimes you will see a decline in productivity, which then would force that food to be produced somewhere else, oftentimes through clearing of rainforest, which would then cause a burst in CO2. Then the other part of that, the other side of that equation is that these life cycle assessments haven't captured the bounds of where they draw the line on emissions is not complete. And so you have these downstream emissions that are not accounted for, that in a sustainable regenerative practice would be lessened because it's not losing as much, and so forth. So it's a little bit muddled right now, the way things are being calculated. And I just wanted to know, just clarify it for me if you can on that, please.
Yeah, no, great question, because land use, and you might not have been able, and I'm sorry if there wasn't great sound, agriculture really is different than other industries because it uses a lot of land. So the land use impact isn't that big a deal with most other sectors of the economy. And that has become an issue of a lot of debate. For example, talking about the impact of, if you measure the true climate impact, say, of corn ethanol, do you take into account all the land to grow the corn that could be otherwise indicted? And if you do, you see that corn ethanol is really not the climate solution that some argue it is. And similarly, have you taken into account the land use, that those 800 million acres of land that are being unfortunately often overgrazed, but in many events grazed to grow cattle. So absolutely critical to take into account the land use. And you're absolutely right that sometimes regenerative or organic, however you want to phrase it, practices can be less productive. That's part of the reason I'm personally very excited about the need for more research in this. I think these practices are sometimes less productive, sometimes more productive. But what's amazing is that we put so little research into this, and we have so little acreage devoted to these practices that frankly, you'd expect them to be a lot less productive because we haven't tried as hard. It seems to me that this is an area where you can only go up if we have more acreage doing it, more research into it, more smart farmers and smart researchers looking at them. That productivity gap, whatever it is, and it's going to differ by region and crop, et cetera, is going to go away. There are a lot of folks who have found that, say, with intense rotational grazing, at least in wet climates like New York and probably Illinois, you actually end up with higher productivity. And our coffee farm, because the shade trees actually in many ways are good for the coffee, and you have to do it carefully and all, our productivity has not gone down because we had to change and we had to think about, okay, maybe different varieties and coffee trees, they are perennial crops. So the short answer is yes, absolutely think about land use. Not enough people do. And it's a really important factor, whether you're thinking about ethanol or beef or any other issue. And two, huge potential in these practices because we've only, as I said, they're only used on what, 1 or 2% of American cropland. We'll know a ton more when we start expanding usage. So, great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Peter. Okay, and now we're kind of venturing into some Farm Bill questions. Before we tap into those, Peter, how many Farm Bills have you worked on?
I know there are a lot of people out there who are real pros, and I do not pretend to be one. I wrote this book because it was a way to force myself to learn at times so I'd be ready. So we work some on only one Farm Bill. I'm not the expert. I feel some confidence in talking about it because people who have worked on 3, 4, 5, 6 Farm Bills have worked very closely with them, and all the good ideas are theirs. All the mistakes are mine, but all the good ideas are theirs. And some of those folks, they've seen a lot of these issues.
Yes, yes. At NSAC, the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, they always ask, how many have you worked on so far? And it can be like little pieces or bigger moments in the Farm Bill. But no, that helps us understand where we're all coming from. This is really my first, so. So Scott and Brendan kind of have a similar question here about, Scott is really asking, what can we do as small organizations and even just individuals to influence the Farm Bill to drive change? And Brendan is kind of expounding on, how can we, is there a reason to believe that industrial agriculture organizations are willing to transform their regenerative business models to then, influence the Farm Bill? So I think they're a little separate. So what can we do to influence change as our organizations go about, or just individually, is the first part of that?
I think first of all, there's no magic bullet. I wish I had one, but I don't. I think the answer is people you're going to be very influential on your local legislators. So go to your local legislators. You may not be able to have big influence on others, but the people who actually represent you and who may or may not be who are concerned about your vote will be making a difference. I think it is really important people who are on the ground, and that's why you will always see farmers who either conventional farmers or more regenerative farmers who are often the best spokespeople for this, who can say this is working or this is not working or whatever. I think you can, as I said at the end of my talk, educate everybody. This is something the Farm Bill is really the most important environmental law that nobody's ever heard of. And most people, everybody eats, we eat a lot, but most people don't realize how important the Farm Bill is to their food, to their air, to their water, to their climate. They might think about engaging on other issues, but not on this. So really just talk to your friends about how important and realizing it's really interesting. I talked to a number of lawyers who are in the private sector and who represent farms, farm co-ops, farm companies. And all of them will be very quick to say that the Farm Bill has an enormous impact on what farmers do. Sometimes you hear people say, well, farmers do what they do just because it's their land. But that policy is, it really drives what they do. In the last couple of years, government payments for most farmers have been somewhere between a third and a half of their total income. So obviously, you're going to manage your operations to maximize those payments. This isn't just a little bit of change on the side. This is a major part of your income. And so those policies have an enormous impact on the food we eat and on the practices on what happens on the ground. And I think that message can get out there and start, and then think about things like impact on drinking water. Wow, why are we spending so much to clean up polluted drinking water? Why don't we keep drinking water clean and those things? So lots of it, there's no one answer, but just dive in there and get engaged.
Yes, and one way to get engaged if you are on the Illinois side is the Alliance is partnering with several organizations to host some Farm Bill 101s this summer. We'll have events in key target districts. So keep an eye out for those. I think that's a really great way to get involved. There's also going to be some events at the end of March that we'll post more about on our Facebook with the National Young Farmers Group and the Central Illinois Young Farmers Group, some listening sessions, and American Farmland Trust is also hosting listening sessions. So everyone's engaging on the Farm Bill and trying to organize as much as possible. And Brendan kind of, he goes in, like I said, to a little more of a pressuring maybe those that, corporate interests. Did you talk about that at all in your book, or did you want to just expound on that a little more on, we can pressure our legislators, but what about the other side of about this?
And great question. And unfortunately, will be my last one, and then I'm going to have to run. But companies can make a big difference. Obviously, I talked earlier about governmental procurement powers, and governments can use companies can use their procurement power as well. I think consumers are more and more interested in at least thinking about sustainability in the food that they purchase. I think you have to worry about greenwashing. There's a lot of greenwashing out there, claims that are not substantiated. But there's a lot of real effort being done. Companies that recognize that the private sector has an important role there as well. And so the way it may work is a company wants to be able to market their, I think some of the big cereal companies have done this. They want to be able to say, either sustainable or regenerative, carbon neutral cereal or something. And of course, they buy grain from farmers. So they're going to then have to help pay those farmers and create incentives for those farmers to use practices that reduce greenhouse gas emissions and store more carbon in the soil, and help figure out how to measure it in a way that is accurate, not too complicated, because you don't want it so complicated that only big farmers can do it. You want it so that small farmers can also engage in the system. So I would say, as a consumer, keep pushing for demanding healthier food and more sustainably produced food, lower greenhouse gas food. Make sure those claims are true. Don't just believe the word when it says natural on the label, if that means anything. It doesn't, by the way. So push the companies as a consumer. One person I remember talking to was a supermarket manager, and he said, 1 or 2 people a week will come talk to us. So if you go talk to your supermarket manager and say, hey, I want to have more sustainable options, I want to have more organic fruits and vegetables, they will listen because you're probably the only person who's talked to them all week. So a real great opportunity there. So again, a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you so much. And I'd be happy, Liz, we can stay in touch, and if you have questions, I will put a plug in. A lot of the questions, answers are in my book. So if people are interested, you can look at that.
Yeah,
So,
no, thank you. I will plug your book again. I know it's probably backwards for you, but Farming for a Future, the Science, Law, and Policy of Climate Neutral Agriculture. I think I heard that you're doing another round of printing because it's sold really, really quick. So you may have to be on a wait list. But Peter, thank you so much for your time. We are grateful for all of your experience here, for the recommendations that we can take away and use to organize for a better, just and regenerative food system.
Thank you. Best wishes to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
All right, everybody. Peter is out. Thank you so much for your time today on day 3, Soil Health Day, Soil Health Summit. We really appreciate you for sticking with us and for sticking with us since 9 a.m. if you have been in for the long haul. We have 2 more days left of Soil Health Week. Tomorrow, join us at noon for a presentation from Aaron Meyer of Basil's Harvest on the regenerative agriculture connection to human health. Been talking about that soil health biome and human health biome, the gut biomes connection. So she's going to let us know all about their research tomorrow. And on Friday, starting at 10 a.m., we'll have Soil Health in the City with 3 experts in the Chicago area. And at noon, we are going to hear from Zumwalt Acres on their research on biochar and basalt rock. All right, well, that is it for today. Go take a break away from the screen, get a snack, and enjoy the rest of your days. I really hope to see you tomorrow at noon. Same Zoom link that we've been using.